Welcome to the live Q&A. I'm Aja Hammerly from the Developer Relations team. In today's Q&A, we'll be focusing on questions related to Urs's keynote, Hidden Forces, What's Next in Enterprise IT? If you haven't had a chance to watch it yet, that's fine. Urs will give us a 60-second recap shortly, and then you can watch the whole thing later. And if you have a burning question that you really want me to ask Urs, there's still time. You need to make sure you're registered and logged in on the Next On Air website, and then click on the Open Q&A button, which is directly below this video. And now, coming to us live from Zurich, I'd like to introduce Urs Hölzle, Google's SVP of Technical Infrastructure.
Hi, Aja. Hi, everyone. Yes, I'm Urs Hölzle, and I'm responsible for the technical infrastructure at Google. That's all the way from the hardware and the data centers and the networks up to the software and the cloud platform itself. And in case you missed it this morning, in my keynote, I talked about two key things for cloud and for the enterprise. First, that enterprise innovation can catch up to the rate of consumer innovation, but only if the enterprise adopts a always up-to-date software stack that works across any cloud and on-premise, of course, and edge. And second, that Anthos is exactly this stack, and that it will play a role similar to what Linux played 20 years or so ago. So Anthos is, as safe and as clear a choice as back then was choosing Linux, because it runs everywhere. It's based on open source and Kubernetes. Because it's based on Kubernetes, everything will run on top of that. And so that makes Anthos a safe choice for the next decade or two, because when you choose it, you don't really give up any other choices, just like when you choose Linux. So that, in a nutshell, was what I talked about this morning, and I'm looking forward to answering your questions either on that or pretty much anything else. So with that, back to you, Aja.
Thanks for the recap. I'm sure that a lot of people haven't had a chance to watch the whole video yet, and so I'm interested, and I'll make sure that people I know watch it later. So first question, this one's from our developer community. And the question is, what can managers and leaders do to help their teams adopt modern development workflows and tools? I know that this is a question we get a lot as advocates when we're out in the field. People want to know, where do I start? What can I do? How do I make this smooth for my team?
Great question, and actually much easier asked than answered. So there's no magic bullet in the end. I think the key, I would say, is to try to learn from someone else. And in a way, that's what we're trying to do with Anthos. So you can look at Anthos as a technology stack, but it's just as much a set of practices that have proven to work well over time. And when you use Anthos, you're really introduced to those techniques, be that about the development itself, or how you push, do gradual pushes, or actually how you operate or how you secure. So I think the key thing is that you want to pick something where actually the workflow itself is opinionated. Someone's actually thought about it, and where you buy not just a piece of technology, or you don't just use a number of tools, but you really use it together in sort of an end-to-end way, and you try to learn from the best. There's a ton of content on YouTube and so on, and there's a ton of content on our developer websites, and that's actually what Aja and her team are great for.
Oh, I'm glad you think so. So you were saying that Anthos is both technology and best practices that have been tried and true by people who've done this a lot, like Google, but others. And one of those best practices that I've heard a lot about is multi-cloud. It's one of the main things that people are excited about that I talk to with Anthos, although there's lots of cool things in Anthos. Can you talk a bit about multi-cloud? Like, what are some of the trade-offs or versus benefits of going with a multi-cloud strategy versus a single cloud strategy? I know this is something a lot of bigger companies are thinking about right now.
Yep. Yeah, I think actually that is a much easier question, because the whole premise, like the trade-off usually comes in two forms. One is says, well, the upside of multi-cloud obviously is that, if you pick something, are you really going to be sure that for the next 20 years this is the right vendor to pick. And so you want to have options, and also, you want to use the best of any world, right? And move at your own pace. Leave some things on premise because right now you don't want to deal with it. Move them at your own time. But then the downside, or the portrayed downside, is that, well, let's say if you use 3 clouds, you actually need to train your team 3 times. And you do security in 3 different ways. And you do all kinds of things 3 different ways. Plus, if you want to be common between them, you're really dumbing down what your cloud is, and you're sort of giving up most of the advantage of cloud. Now, fortunately, that is actually false. And Anthos actually shows why. Because the beauty of Anthos is that it doesn't try to do too much. It standardizes the things that should not be different, the things that aren't necessarily special. Let's say, how do you actually release a binary? How do you configure something? How do you define a load balancer? How do you distribute certificates to your services? These are all things you have to do every day, and they should not be different between the clouds. And so Anthos says, learn it once with Anthos, and then you can pick your cloud or multiple clouds or stay on premise, and you don't have to learn that task again. So for all the tasks and practices and workflows that Anthos covers, you really have just one team, one time where you have to learn it, and then you can still take the advantage of the uniqueness of each environment without having to relearn all the basics again. So fortunately, I think this is a false trade-off. And I think you really want to pick a platform that does not lock you in for the next 20 years into one way of doing things, right? So in my view, that's an easy answer. Pure win. Go with multi-cloud, or be ready for multi-cloud and have the option, because who knows what's going to happen in the next 10, 20 years.
Yeah, so it sounds like, and this was my understanding, that multi-cloud has a lot of advantages: flexibility, being able to do things on the right timeline for your team, being able to use specific cloud-specific features that you need. But Anthos is kind of the secret sauce here, in that it takes away a lot of the disadvantages about having to learn multiple clouds, about having to have a team trained on multiple clouds. And that's awesome. I know that I've had to make a decision about on-prem or cloud or both, and both was always scary just because of the sheer information overload that we had to keep track of. And I'm glad Anthos exists now. Didn't have it back then. So now we got a question from Twitter. According to you, what are the missing pieces of cloud today?
I'd say lots. And actually, let me put it in a slightly different way. I think if we put ourselves, in our mind into 2025, and we look back on 2020 and the cloud of 2020, I think we'll be embarrassed that we liked it and that we thought it was good, right? Because it will seem incredibly primitive. Because even though cloud is, 10 years old, it actually still is in its early stages. So I often compare it to kind of mobile phones after their first 10, 15 years. It was sort of Nokia and BlackBerry, right? It wasn't Android and iOS. And so the Android and iOS of cloud is still coming. And one of the things that really made that explosion of functionality in the mobile space, that made you really rethink what you expect of a mobile phone, that made you look back on your feature phone and kind of be surprised that you ever liked it, right, was the fact that there were software platforms that, a set of APIs that were auto update and that allowed you to roll out your service to anyone on that platform and not have a ton of friction from, version matrix and sort of anything. And so that's one of the things that I think really today is missing in a cloud. If you're on a single cloud, then things are fine in the sense they're consistent, but, beware if you ever see the need to either remain on premise or use another cloud because it has an awesome service, because you're just completely starting from scratch. And I think 5 years from now, you'll just say, wow, I cannot believe that this was missing, back then. It's kind of like saying, what, there were phones without an app store on it? That is really hard to believe. Like, you mean a phone that was there like to make calls? That's really all it did? Like, it's hard for us to think about today. So I predict that in 2025, we'll really be in that point where we kind of are embarrassed about the cloud of 2020, because from the developer's perspective, from the security perspective, from the operations perspective, and really from the portability perspective, today's cloud, and actually today's cloud world, really isn't a great world, and we want to change that.
Awesome. And the phone analogy is super helpful. I know that I explained to my nieces a couple months ago that my first BlackBerry only had the game Snake, and they were horrified that I didn't have an app store to use. So I'm curious what that's going to look like. It's going to be amazing for the cloud world to have that big of a transformation and so quickly. So let's take another question from the Dory. Actually, this question's from our developer community, and this one's close to my heart as a manager. How do you effectively manage high-performing technical teams? My team is awesome, and any tips you can give for the managers in the audience about how we can do better would be great.
Wow. Okay, that's a complicated question again. So there's no simple answer. I think the one thing I would always mention first that people really underappreciate is hiring, because if you hire the right people, then A, it's going to make a bigger difference than anything else you do. And B, management actually becomes much easier, right? Because you have great people who are doing a great job and they need your support, but they don't really need your sort of corrective action all the time. And let me just double down on the importance of hiring. Like if you think about it, suppose that you're at your company, and suppose you spend a full 10% of your time for an entire year, right? So 10% every single week you spend on hiring, right? You interview people, you're trying to recruit people, whatever, right? And suppose for all that effort, you find just one person, a single person, in that year who is as good as you are, right? I would argue that with that 10% of your time, you have doubled your productivity, right, to the company. And there's nothing else that you can do in 10% of your time that doubles your impact, right? There's really nothing else, right? You cannot work harder. You can't, make better tools. Like it just does not give you a factor of 10. So hiring really, I think, is the key to management. And I think if you pay attention to that, if you do that well, then the rest follows much more easily.
Awesome. That's a really insightful answer, and I'll have to think a bit more about that. So let's take a more nerdy question from the Dory. Operational frictions oftentimes leads to learning opportunities. Eliminating friction equals eliminating opportunities for people to learn. I think what this question is saying is that when stuff goes wrong and your pager goes off, it is just another learning opportunity. Is that always good?
That is right. So, I mean, there's a good observation, but I'd separate it into two ways, right? One is in the average company, there is so much productive learning, like learning that you want to do because you get advantages from it, and it's sort of pure upside, right? You learn about containers or about CI/CD or whatever. In the average company, there's so much in need of that you really want to focus on that kind of learning versus learning from your mistakes, right, so to speak, or from outages. Now, the second part is that actually it is very important to learn from your outages or to learn from your mistakes. So in the case of outages, postmortems, and especially blameless postmortems, are like focusing on what went wrong and how do we prevent that from happening, not like who made a mistake, right? So blameless postmortems and learning from mistakes. Again, like maybe a postmortem for something in your project or a technical decision. That's really when the learning happens. So I agree with you that like the best way to summarize that is, let no crisis go to waste, right? A crisis is a huge opportunity to actually change how you're doing things and avoid the next crisis. So I'm definitely a big fan, but I think if that becomes the dominant form of your learning, then you're in a problematic spot.
Yeah, no, you don't want everything to be on fire all the time. And I'm really glad you mentioned blameless postmortems. More than anything I've learned in my 5 years at Google, learning about the blameless postmortem culture and how you can learn as a team and do better as a team has done wonders, not only for my work life, but also for my personal life and dealing with stuff that goes sideways at home, especially right now. So yeah, that's great. So now a question from Twitter. Who are your inspirations when it comes to tech? Who do you look up to?
Boy, I don't want to name my favorite children, so to speak. But I think what I admire and what inspires me is when there are things that in retrospect seem obvious, but nobody thought of them for 10 years, right? So if someone
Mm.
finds something that five, even 2 years from now, right? If someone hears about it, it's like, yeah, that seems pretty obvious that it's done this way, but it took 10 years, 20 years to find that. That to me is the most amazing thing, and the thing I admire most in people. So it's really often the simplicity that actually makes something awesome, versus something incredibly complicated that sometimes is unavoidable. But really, what I admire are things that seem obvious, but until they became obvious, they weren't obvious.
Okay, that makes sense. And it's definitely been my experience. I got some advice early on in my career that you should always be cautious of the person who asks the seemingly dumb question, because they've likely seen how simpler your solution could be. So that's great. So our next question is from, I believe, the Dory, and it is kind of long. So I'm going to read it, but then I'm going to try to summarize it a bit. So the question says, I'm worried that the Cloud Run Knative push for scale to zero is leaving customers with cascading long startup latency issues as they move to microservices, which get paged or swapped out while not in use. Can you endorse a scale to one alternative, please, to have support always having an instance ready, to support always having instance ready? So this actually seems slightly like a feature request, less than a question, but it does bring up an interesting question about how do you prioritize the advantages of something like scale to zero and adopting a microservices architecture over the fact that there are some downsides. Scale to zero has startup latency issues. Like, how would you address that if you were trying to work with a team that was migrating to a microservices architecture on, say, Knative?
Yep. Great question. So first of all, not my job to endorse something or not. Like I'm not a sports star that gets paid for product placement, so to speak. So I would actually answer it slightly differently, and it's not the job of the provider to pick. It's really the job of each of the teams to pick. And I always say engineering is the art of the compromise, because if there was a dominant best answer, then it would be pretty boring and pretty easy, because like everyone does that, and end of story, right? And so it's really about trade-offs, and the trade-offs differ by industry, by customer, by team even, right? And so in this particular case, the nice thing about scale to zero is zero cost when you don't use it. And so for some things, that's a really great solution. Like suppose you have an internal app and it gives you the W-2 that you download. For those of you international, W-2 is your tax form for your end of year tax form. Well, probably 360 days of the year, nobody uses that app, and you don't want to pay for it. So scale to zero is great. And if the first person has to wait, a second or two to download their tax return, that's fine, because once tax season is there, the application is probably hot, right? On the other hand, as you say, that actually if you have a different app that maybe is idle for a little while, but then is being used again, and then idle for a while and used again, you kind of don't want to introduce multi-second startup latency for the poor person who's the next person to use your app. So to me, that's a trade-off. I think it's a good feature request. You can actually easily implement that yourself by just having a little. Actually, you should probably do end-to-end monitoring of your key workflows. And so if you did that frequently enough, you will keep your functions warm, and your startup latency is low. But to me, again, it really comes down to engineering and figuring out what is the business value, right? What problem are we solving, and what are the options that we have? And among these, which one is the least worst, right? Sometimes called the best, right? Usually the best isn't actually flawless, right? Everything has some problems. So that I think is a great place to end, and really say, I agree with you. Should be actually a simple configuration option, like never going down to zero. I value latency over totally minimal cost. Don't think we have that in Knative, but if you know how to file a feature request, I think it's a good one actually.
Yeah, so it seems like the answer is like the answer to almost every technical question is it depends. It depends on your use case, and it
Right.
depends on what the right choice for your engineering team is, which might have to do with the people you have and the time they have and the skills they have. So that's amazing, and I know that I don't know that we don't have it. I should know the answer to this, and I don't, and I'm slightly embarrassed about that. So next question from Twitter. Actually, no, this next question is from the Dory. This is a good one. What are some of your favorite failed Google infrastructure projects that were such cool ideas that they had to be tried, irrespective of the outcome?
Well, first of all, if you knew the outcome, you wouldn't have tried it probably, even if it was cool, right? So I mean, failures happen because you don't quite predict what's going to happen. I think on in infrastructure side, one of the things I would want to mention actually goes back 15 years ago. So 15 years ago, we got into building our own data centers because we were sort of running out of rented data centers, and we could see the time that the rents would really go up because up until about that point, for those of you who were there, the internet bubble burst in 2000, and there was just boatloads of data center space that was empty and was cheap to rent. And so as we were growing, we were really growing into a lot of empty space that went through bankruptcies and therefore was really cheap. But so as we were seeing that coming to an end, we thought about like, well, what do we do to make our own data centers? And obviously they got to be cheap, and not just cheap to build, but also cheap to operate. And one of the things we noticed was that, almost half of our data center bill was energy, power. And what was actually really offensive is that a significant fraction of that, again, about half of that was completely wasted. Like it wasn't actually energy to power your CPU and your memory. It just went elsewhere. The building cooling, your power supply, like all kinds of places that you didn't really care about. Right? And so we started to build more efficient data centers. And our first approach was what's called the containerized data center. And so basically the idea was instead of building really a building and trying to cool the building, why don't you just cool the servers? And by the way, put those servers into literally a shipping container. And then inside that shipping container, it's very easy to control the airflow. And then you have sort of a modular unit where you can deploy, let's say, space for 1,000 servers at a time, and you just put this in a warehouse. And you can go to YouTube, look for container data center, Google, something like that. We have some videos way back from 2005. And it turned out to be a great idea in some aspects, like it was actually very efficient, and it was pretty cheap. But it turned out those containers were actually sort of unwieldy. You needed large buildings to kind of maneuver them in and out, and a crane and all kinds of things. And then also it would really constrain your space, right? That the shipping container is a fixed form factor. You had to kind of cram in your servers, and they were not really, deep enough, et cetera. And so really that was, a big failure in some extent. Like we did it once and never again. But at the same time, it was really one of these classic opportunities where it was fairly fast to fail, and we learned a ton, and we actually used a lot of those principles in our next data center, which we actually called containerless, or the non-tainer, like the non-container, where we could preserve a lot of the cooling efficiency and the cheapness, but basically, put all of that into the row of the server versus an entire enclosure, right? And so even today, what you see sort of in each server row is actually looks pretty low tech. If you go look up some pictures or some videos, it's just kind of metal, and the metal is really sort of a mini container for a server that's in each slot, but we don't have the container around. So that is probably one of my favorite failures, because it definitely was a failure. Like that was not in the end a great idea, but it led to actually rapid innovation in the data center space, and actually was a step that though you partially regret it, was a failure that really paid off.
Yeah, I remember reading a lot about Google's containerized data centers, and those were cool. And I'm glad that lots of cool technology came out of it too, and new approaches.
They were actually hot. They were actually hot, 27 degrees.
They were hot. Yes, of course.
80 degrees Fahrenheit, yes.
And Google's all about containers. So last question. What will the next game changer within cloud be? Is it going to be quantum computing?
Probably not the next one, because quantum computing is one of these things that, when it works, it will be awesome. But at the same time, there's some really, pretty big problems left. And though we're kind of making progress, it's always kind of 5 years plus out, right? And when someone tells you it's 5 years out, they really kind of mean, I'm not sure how long it will take, right? So I hope that there's innovation in cloud before. I do think that one of the game changers really is to change cloud away from thinking about it as three different clouds and you have to choose one of the three. I think that really is going to be outdated very soon. And it's going to kind of feel like, for those of you who were around in 1995, it was sort of servers were new, away from mini computers and mainframes. PCs were new, x86, Unix was new, like Java was new. Like the enterprise really kind of needed to change how it did computing. And back then, everyone's sort of obsessed about, should I pick DEC or Sun or Compact? Like, which vendor do I pick? Which hardware vendor? But it was not just a hardware vendor, because if you picked one hardware vendor, you got a different OS and you got a different compiler and you got a different databases. And like you picked the whole thing, everything was different, right? And that's kind of the mode that we're in today with cloud. If you pick one cloud, then like the way you start the container or the way you start a VM is different from somewhere else. But that actually kind of doesn't make sense, right? It's just starting a container, and in the end, sort of everyone does the same thing. So why isn't it the same? So in the server space back in 95, it took about 10 years for that to play out. And 10 years later, people realized that it's not about picking the server vendor. That's important for hardware reasons, but it's not a choice that you have to stick with for the next 20 years. The choice that matters is, well, back in 2005, was Linux versus Windows Server, right? Like if you picked one of them, that stayed with you for a decade or two. And in this particular case, if you picked Linux and if you picked open source, you really picked a growing ecosystem around it, and you could pick anything below and pretty much anything above. And so that's what we're really trying to do to the cloud space with Anthos, to say, Anthos is kind of like Minix. It's not the same because it's managed. So you do get open source, but you don't have to worry about the updates and security patches, et cetera. But it actually has the same sort of horizontal property where now you don't really care about what's below. You may still care about it for performance or cost reasons, but it's not a stack that's below. It's kind of more like hosting. And then above, it's pretty much anything. So any service you want to consume, any development practice you want to use, you can do that. And that's independent of the environment. So that to me really actually is a game changer, because it moves the whole thinking away from sort of the AOL model, like pick AOL and then AOL, and then everything is the AOL way, to the internet model where you pick open standards and then you can mix and match and really adopt the things that work best for you and do something, like if you picked Linux 20 years ago, it's still with you and it's still a great choice, because all the other things around it, you could change your opinion, your choice. And so Linux didn't constrain you in that way. And that's really, I think, what the big revolution in cloud will be, that Anthos, together with Kubernetes, gives you that same portability and that same learn it once and then just do it for the next 10 years. That really changes how people look at cloud.
That makes a lot of sense. And it totally makes sense that moving toward open standards that work anywhere is going to give people the flexibility to do what's right for them, which is awesome. So I want to thank you so much for chatting with us today and sharing your thoughts and insights. And I want to thank our audience for joining us virtually and submitting some really insightful, thoughtful questions. This Q&A isn't the only thing we have going on this week at Next On Air, though. There's lots going on, and I want to encourage all of you to check out some of the other things. So if you want to dig in and learn more, we have a couple different options available. First of all, you can book a one-on-one session with a Googler, chat or video chat for 15 minutes, talk more about the products or specific problems you have, or find out more about what learning content is right for you. To do that, you can book a session at the URL on your screen right now. I also want to do a shout out for my team. We're hosting a live developer talk session this Friday. Two folks I work with, Dave and Ian, are going to be hosting that. And you want to learn more about that, the URL is the second one on your screen, Talks by DevRel. And I know a lot of folks, I've definitely like this, and I know a lot of our developer audience just wants to dig in and get their hands dirty. They don't want to hear about it. They don't want to read about it. They just want to try it. And if that's you, it doesn't have to be all of you, but there's probably a few of you in the audience. I can recommend our Learning Hub. Go to the next Learning Hub and go do a code lab. Do some tutorials. Just get your hands dirty. Try it. See if it's going to work for you. That's the fastest way often to fail fast and learn if something is the right match for the problems you currently have. And check out the rest of our content as part of Next on Air. We've done a lot of work to create super cool talks, demos, and other ways that you can learn about what's happening, what's new, and what models are working for people who use Google Cloud. I've been really proud of the work that's happened in the talks that have been created. So finally, close out. I want to thank Urs again, and I want to thank all of you for showing up. This was fantastic, and I learned a lot.
Thank you too, Aja, and thanks everyone for joining us.